but I just wanted to welcome everybody. So we're excited to have people, and they'll be coming on throughout the time. I want to welcome, I know right now we have transplant patients and their family members and friends, medical providers, researchers, staff, and people that are just interested in this topic. And I think we all, as a healthcare community and a patient community and a human being community, are curious about the COVID vaccines. So we're committed that this be a valuable hour for everybody. And for people who don't know me, my name is Dr. Amy Waterman. I'm a professor in nephrology at UCLA and the deputy director of the Terasaki Research Institute. I thank the Terasaki Research Institute and my staff for supporting this important community discussion. I also want to thank everyone who's on the call, that I'm going to do their introductions in just a second. Our panel today is going to discuss how the new COVID-19 vaccines work, the clinical trial findings so far, and a new transplant vaccine trial that has begun. We're going to answer common questions that we're hearing from the transplant patients and our community. And you're welcome, everybody who's listening, to add any questions that you have into the chat, and we're going to try to get as many of those answers as we have time for. So I reached out to some wise counsel that I know, both patients and providers, and they were generous enough to give me an hour of their time. And I want to introduce them in alphabetical order. So first, I'd like to introduce Candace Clocklin, a transplant recipient and a patient mentor. Candace, can you wave? Yep, cool. Dr. Gabe Danovich is joining us. He's a professor at UCLA Nephrology and the medical director of UCLA's Kidney and Pancreas Transplant Program. He's on his way in right now. George Franklin is a transplant recipient and the president of the Quarter Century Club for patients who have had transplants for over 25 years. George, such a great thing to have you on the call today. Jim Gleason, he's a transplant recipient and the president of Transplant Recipients International Organization. Louise Lermignon is a 12-year living donor transplant recipient and a patient advocate. We have Dr. Dore Segev, a transplant surgeon and head of the transplant vaccine trial at Johns Hopkins University. And Dr. Bill Werbel, a board-certified infectious diseases expert and transplant physician at Johns Hopkins University. So welcome to all of you. Anything anybody wants to say to kick us off from the panel, and then I'll get started on the questions? Okay, let's go. So I'll be your moderator, and I want to start with some orienting questions. I think that we hear a lot in the media, but let's get to some real accurate medical content about questions about the vaccines and the clinical trials. I want to let people know who are part of the call that we reached out to the transplant community ahead of time, and we've added many of the questions that were asked into the discussion today. So Dr. Werbel, let's kick us off. Can you explain simply how these new vaccines protect individuals from COVID-19? Bill, can you hear me? Hold on. Bill, can you unmute?
I think we're good now.
Oh, great. Great.
Yeah,
so Bill, thank you so much.
Administrative help.
Okay, good.
I want to also second and say,
let me ask the question. Yeah, is it okay if I ask the question again?
Go again.
Wonderful, thanks. Can you explain simply how these new vaccines protect individuals from COVID-19?
Sure, I think that's a great place to start. I'd also like to just also say thank you, and thank you to the panelists and Terasaki Institute for inviting us. So much of what I'll talk about is really reflecting what the FDA and CDC have endorsed and what medical journals also endorse. If there's anything that's my personal opinion, I'll try to preface it. But just to start, I mean, the purpose of vaccine in general is to essentially give our bodies a head start, right? To be exposed to some aspect of a virus or bacteria in a controlled setting, so that if we encounter it in the real world, we've already had a revved up immune system that can hopefully reduce our getting sick from this type of infection. And in this case, we're talking about SARS-CoV-2, the novel coronavirus that causes COVID-19. So the two authorized vaccines so far, the Pfizer and Moderna mRNA vaccines. They're called mRNA because that's the technology, which is relatively new. And it refers to the fact that you're injected with a blueprint, an mRNA code for a specific piece of the coronavirus, not the full virus, but a piece of it. Your cells then make this piece, show it to your immune system over time, and then you develop antibodies, and other parts of the immune system are kind of revved up to ideally fill this goal of giving you a head start if you were to encounter the virus in the real world. So that's really the mechanism, that sort of decoding the code you're injected with.
Great. So are the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines different in how they work, or the same?
I would say for our intents and purposes, they're extremely similar. So they're both mRNA based, and they both have that blueprint for the same piece of the coronavirus, just with like mild kind of proprietary differences. Some of the preservatives in the vaccine are a little bit different, but effectively they can be considered relatively equivalent. And I think most important, and I think you're going to probably follow up on this, is that neither is a live vaccine. They're both that blueprint for basically a dead piece of a protein that then your body makes more of. It does not assemble an entire virus, right? And so fortunately, you can't get infected with COVID from these vaccines.
Okay, great. So then can you walk us through what's already happened during the clinical trials phase to assess whether these vaccines work for people and are safe?
Got you. And this is going to be citing some of that FDA and other published material. So I'll probably just fast forward to the biggest trials in people, which were these trials in the New England Journal of Medicine for Pfizer and Moderna. The Pfizer vaccine had about 45,000 people, so over 20,000 got vaccine, and in the Moderna trial, it was over 15,000 got vaccines. And they were followed for several months after vaccination to see who got infected and how frequently. And so I guess I'll mention also that these trials included similar kinds of people from teenagers to 90 years of age. About a third of people had some kind of medical condition like obesity or diabetes. However, explicitly for our purposes, transplant patients were excluded. So regardless of the people who were included, after that follow-up that I mentioned, about 95%, there was about 95% vaccine effectiveness, which means by the time they sort of took a look at the data, over 95% of the infections were in the placebo group. And so just to put numbers on it, like for the Pfizer vaccine, by the time they followed it out, there were around 160 infections in the placebo, and there were only like 8 in the vaccine group. And this also included the majority of serious infections, like going into hospital and everything, that were in the placebo group. So it was pretty similar between both trials. And that's kind of the effectiveness part, which was excellent. To talk about the safety part, at the 10,000-foot view, I'll say fortunately no one died from getting the vaccine or had anything that was severely life-threatening felt to be related to the vaccine. However, reactions, which in our context are going to be side effects related to how good of an immune response the vaccine produces, these were relatively common. In particular, injection site reactions, so like where you had your shot, the majority of people had some pain there, which is not to be too surprising. But I'll say that something like 10 to 20% of people had at least moderate pain there, which is a little more than we would see with like a flu shot. The other thing to think about in terms of safety, safety would be the kind of systemic symptoms, like how people felt generally, and also relatively commonly, like up to around 50% of people, particularly in younger people after the second vaccine, felt some kind of feeling under the weather, if you will, like a headache, muscle aches, or fatigue. This was also generally mild and lasted for 2 to 3 days, but in somewhere like 5% of people, 5 to 10%, it was relatively profound, like something where you didn't feel like you wanted to get out of the house for a couple of days, or you had a relatively high fever, like 102 fever, something like that. Fortunately, none of these were things that required people necessarily to be hospitalized, and they all resolved for the most part with either on their own or with things like Tylenol or ibuprofen. And the last thing in the interest of time I'll mention is allergic reactions, because I think that's been in the news a lot. About 1% of people in the trials had some kind of allergy, which is usually like hives or a rash, but there were no cases of things like anaphylaxis, emergencies. However, now that we've given vaccines to 5 million people in the United States, the CDC has been following very closely. And after the first 2 million doses were given, there have been about 20 episodes of anaphylaxis. So like 1 out of 100,000 people having a severe reaction requiring something like an EpiPen. And this is predominantly in people who already had a history of reactions requiring EpiPens or reactions to things like vaccines. But so very uncommon, but continuing to be followed by the CDC.
Right. And knowing kind of the UCLA policy is they ask everyone after a vaccine to wait 15 minutes to see if there's potentially any immediate reactions that are allergies. So so you stay near the medical professionals to ensure that if there is a high risk. Do you guys have that at Johns Hopkins?
Yeah, and this is also recommended by the CDC and the FDA. Actually, it's even waiting to up to 30 minutes if you're someone who had a history of anaphylaxis to something else before. And I think we'll get to some more kind of people who should and should not get the vaccine a little later.
So then they looked at so after the clinical trials, all of the smart people looked at the outcomes and were there anything severe, and there were emergency authorizations issued for both the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine. What does that mean exactly? And is it approved for everyone or just some people?
Sure. So it's a kind of technical term. Essentially, if there's a public health emergency where there's a treatment that's felt to be effective and the the benefits outweigh the risks, and there's no alternative, the FDA can authorize something to be used. In this case, these vaccines really fit the bill. It's not technically FDA approval, which usually takes quite a long time and has a lot of paperwork, which is not always appropriate during an emergency. So it's a very broad approval. Basically, for the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, basically anyone from ages, for Pfizer it's 16 and up, and Moderna it's 18 and up, are eligible unless they are acutely sick they don't recommend giving you a vaccine if you're acutely ill with something. B, you've had a history of anaphylaxis to the actual vaccine before, or components of the vaccine, which we can talk about because they're kind of like, preservatives and whatnot. I would say, yeah, I'll probably stop it there. Everything else is more like caution. Like if you're someone who's had anaphylaxis to something else, you need to be monitored for a certain amount of time. And they explicitly say, again, for our purposes, if you are somebody who's immunocompromised, we don't technically know the safety and efficacy because these people were excluded from trials, but being a transplant patient is not a reason that you cannot be vaccinated. That's explicitly mentioned, but with the caveats I kind of just said. Right.
So then walk us through what's happening now for the rollout of the vaccine nationally, and when might transplant patients get it?
It's an amazing question, and I don't consider myself a vaccine distribution expert. I think we all could probably anticipate that it was going to be complicated. What I'll just mention is that the majority of transplant patients are considered tier 1C. So like after healthcare workers and people in nursing facilities, and then after people who are over the ages of 75 or frontline workers, that's basically after those people, it'll be every other transplant patient. That said, if you're a transplant patient who falls in any of those earlier groups, you're eligible now. The wrinkle is that the federal government gave recommendations, and now every state, and sometimes even down to the county level, will make decisions. So for example, in Florida, the governor said that anyone over the age of 65 can now be vaccinated. Whereas in Massachusetts, just starting next week, are we moving to the phase 1B, the people who are frontline workers, let's say, but not including all the other people who have medical conditions. So long answer for a short question that I don't know. I would unfortunately imagine that it may take several months for the most transplant patients in the US to be eligible, like March, April, May.
Great. Thank you so much for the overview. Okay, Dory and Gabe, I'd like you to kind of answer some group questions together. Let me start with Dory. So have any transplant patients been part of the vaccine trials or received the vaccine to date? And have any problems been noted so far? Dory, you're muted. Oh, is he blocked again?
Okay, now I'm unmuted. There seems to be some system where, because we were initially muted by the host, then we can't unmute.
Okay, maybe unmute everybody and then we can control it. Thank you.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Absolutely. Okay, so knowing the orientation that we just went through, have any transplant patients received the vaccine to date since the clinical trials, and have any problems been noted so far?
Yeah, so as you know, and most transplant patients know, transplant patients were basically excluded from the phase 3 trials, for the goal of, making the trials homogeneous and, being able to answer sort of broader questions. What that means is that we don't have data from the trials on how transplant patients have done with the vaccine. However, as Bill raised earlier, there are transplant patients who are healthcare workers. There are transplant patients who are part of this early rollout for the vaccine, and they have received the vaccine. And we are aware of a number of transplant patients who have already received their first dose, and we're actually aware of some of them who have already gone to receive their second dose. And so I guess I would estimate, just this is a guess, but I would estimate that probably several hundred transplant patients have received at least a first dose of the vaccine, thinking about how many transplant patients there are out there and how many are healthcare workers, et cetera. So I think there is now early experience with the vaccine because of the rollout, not because of a specific trial that the companies are running, but because transplant patients are now receiving the vaccine.
And have you heard anything about transplant recipients, particularly right now, on problems that may have happened or a larger prevalence of a problem that's been named for the general population?
Yeah, so this kind of foreshadows what we'll talk about with our effort to engage transplant patients who have received the vaccine. We've heard nothing at our center, and we've heard nothing through sort of the general transplant ID, transplant healthcare worker community about major problems that any transplant patients have had. I personally know a number of transplant patients who have received the vaccine, and nobody has heard any rumors of a major reaction, a major impact on the kidney, a major impact on, the immune system or something like that. Again, these are all not organized in a systematic way, but the transplant community, as we all know, is a pretty small community. And if a transplant surgeon, who is a transplant recipient, got the vaccine and had a major problem with it, I'm pretty sure we would know about it.
Absolutely. Okay, Gabe, can you unmute and make sure we can hear you? I'd like you to weigh in on some things.
I have to unmute. Okay.
Wonderful, we can hear you.
Okay.
So Gabe, in the last year, what have you seen at UCLA in terms of how COVID-19 has been affecting transplant patients? Just in general, not about the vaccine, just the impact of COVID-19 without the vaccine.
COVID-19 is a dangerous infection for transplant patients. There's no question about it. The incidence of serious side effects and hospitalizations, in need of ventilator and morbidity and mortality are much higher in transplant patients than the general population. And also considerably higher than other risk groups, like groups with hypertension, Latinx, diabetes. I don't want to give specific numbers, but there is a significant mortality rate. This is a dangerous infection. This is a very dangerous infection for transplant patients, not just kidney infections, particularly lung transplant patients are particularly in danger. But all transplant patients, immunosuppressed patients, have to regard this infection with great care. I tell my patients not to be fearful, but to be very careful with the standard, CDC recommendations: hand washing, mask, distancing, all those things. They have to take them very, very seriously.
And why is it so serious for our group, our community, particularly over other groups that are facing other illnesses?
Presumably because their immune systems have already been kind of manipulated for us to keep the transplant working. So their immune systems have been weakened somewhat. Mostly their immune systems can deal with garden variety infections. Most of our transplant patients can, for instance, have a common cold or influenza, and do very well because their immune systems are still active. They've just been turned down a bit. But COVID seems to exploit the fact that the immune system is not as strong as it might otherwise be. Also, many of our patients don't get transplants in a vacuum. They get transplants because they've had other illnesses. They've had diabetes, they've had hypertension, they may be overweight. There are other reasons that are there in the background. So they are a high-risk group.
So now that we are at this point of having Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, what are your thoughts now as a head of a transplant center about giving transplant patients the vaccine?
I strongly encourage all our transplant patients to get the vaccine. Absolutely, without hesitation. Even though, as my predecessors on the call have said, we don't know everything about transplant, about the use of the vaccine in transplant patients, and these trials weren't specifically done in transplant patients. Any small risk of side effects from the vaccine are greatly overwhelmed by the benefit that the vaccine can give them, because of the risk of COVID. I strongly encourage all our patients to get the vaccine.
And Dorian, Bill, would you like to add anything? How do you feel after looking at all of this data and watching what's happening?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, as Dr. Danovich says, the impact of COVID infection on a transplant patient can be profound, both in the short term and in the long term, and in things that we don't even know what will be in the long term. I would say, you know, Bill nicely outlined a very, very small group of people who might be exceptions to the rule that everybody should get the vaccine, like somebody who we anticipate an anaphylactic reaction. I think also, you know, transplant patients have to think about their own risk of acquiring the infection, and that risk right now is incredibly high. We have 300,000 new cases every day. We had 4,000 deaths yesterday. That is a lot scarier than, oh, you know, I might drop my blood pressure and have to be monitored for half an hour after getting the vaccine. So I think that when you weigh the two, there are almost no transplant patients that would not be likely to benefit from getting a vaccine.
And Gabe, can you speak to, so for patients who are just new and just have gotten a transplant, are there any people at different phases in, you know, I'm about to get a transplant, should I get the vaccine before I get a transplant, or I'm immediately post-transplant? Do you have any recommendations for people along the journey?
Yes, we actually had a pretty high level discussion at UCLA yesterday on this. We're going to recommend, and this I think is also coming out of the major transplant societies, the kidney transplant patients wait approximately a month, but get vaccinated as soon as they can after a month has passed of their transplant. Now, if they can get vaccinated before the transplant, that's all the better. You know, patients who are having living donor transplants in the next couple of months, we can anticipate when they're getting a transplant, and we're trying to work to see that they can get vaccinated before they have the transplant. Most of our patients are on dialysis, and they're not under our direct control. We're not controlling. We're not their doctors because they're on at dialysis centers, and we're strongly encouraging them whenever possible and wherever they can get vaccinated while they are dialysis patients. So the more patients who get vaccinated pre-transplant, the better. And the more patients who, once they've had a transplant, after a month has gone by, unless they've had some specific therapies that may change that, I don't want to go into the details necessarily now. We would recommend that after a month has gone by, they would get the transplant. Now, they will get the vaccine. Now, there's a lot of patients out there. There's a lot of people out there. And as everyone knows, and we all kind of read the same newspapers, vaccine distribution has been disappointing in terms of how much of it is getting out there. And I wish I could say that our patients are going to get vaccinated very quickly, but I don't know. My sense is it may be several months before all our patients can get the vaccine that they should be getting. I hope that will change. I hope that will change.
Yeah. Patients have asked me if they've had COVID, can they still get the vaccine? What do you tell them?
So that's a question. I'm not necessarily the best person to answer that question, but I've been told, I understand that the immunity you have from the actual illness may not necessarily be that long lasting, and that after a few months it might still be valuable for patients who have had COVID to get vaccinated. But I'm not necessarily the right person to answer that question. That's something that I think they should address with their own providers based on antibody levels, etc.
Okay.
I would agree with Gabe and just add that the national recommendations have been, and the society recommendations, as Gabe said, have been to be vaccinated even if you had a prior COVID infection. And I would guess biologically, since if anything, we would expect immunity to last less long in transplant patients than in non-transplant patients, especially for transplant patients. The recommendation would be to give vaccinated even if you had a previous COVID infection.
Okay, great.
Amy, I'm going to have to split.
Okay, thank you,
So
Gabe, so much for being
any
here.
other specific questions I can help with?
I've got a great panel, but is there anything in the chat that Gabe should field, Louise? Okay, then we're great, Gabe. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you all. I wish you all be safe and well. And my friends out there, I give you all of you a virtual elbow. So let's just do it, man.
That's great. Thank you, Gabe.
Everyone.
Appreciate it. Okay, so it's great to have Gabe. So let's talk about the risks and the benefits then. So when you talk about informed decision making, you weigh the good against the bad and you make the best decision for you. And what we know is that there's some information we don't know right now about the vaccines, right? So Dory, can you kick us off and say, okay, so everybody's making this decision. We're not here to tell you what you should do. This should be done with your transplant team and all of that, but we want this information to be helpful. So what do you think people should be weighing?
Yeah, so I mean, you know, as we've mentioned before, if you get COVID as a transplant patient, that is a dangerous endeavor. And we know that there have been published mortality rates as high as 30%. Of course, there have been published mortality rates as low as 5%. So we don't really know exactly what will happen to you, but we know it probably won't be very good. And the risks of getting the vaccine, really, I would say, aside from this anaphylactic thing that Bill talked about earlier, which is very exceedingly rare and probably will not impact anybody on this call, the only things I would classify as risks of the vaccine in transplant patients is the fact that we don't know specifically, right? And this is kind of the difference. You know, you'll read scientists will say, well, this has not been studied, so we can't really say anything about it. But those of us who take care of patients can't do that. We have to make judgments based on what we know. What we know is that in 100,000 people, this seems to work really, really, really well and is very, very safe. And that we don't expect that transplant patients will act any differently from non-transplant patients in terms of the risks of the vaccine. There are some things we don't know, and I presume that we'll talk a little bit later about the study that we're doing to try to understand those risks. But I think in terms of risk-benefit decision-making, for the overwhelming majority of transplant patients, the benefit of being vaccinated will be far higher than the risks of having the vaccine.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So there are things we don't know. Why don't you let everyone know about the transplant vaccine trial? And so we've got some open questions, and the transplant community and the research community, and with Dory at the lead and a lot of good people backing him up, are saying we should get the answers to those questions too. Let me set you up and you can go ahead and explain what the trial is.
Sure. So we're running a national trial, leveraging the fact that transplant patients are already getting the vaccine. Many have already gotten it, and many, many more will be getting it in the next few months. We don't have vaccine to give to transplant patients, but vaccine is being distributed across the country. And what we've done through outreach from societies, patient advocacy groups, social media, et cetera, is spread the word about a study that we're doing based at Johns Hopkins, but in collaboration with a lot of big groups, including the National Kidney Foundation. We are enrolling people who are transplant recipients who plan to get the vaccine. And then when you get your call and you schedule your vaccine, we're going to send you for baseline labs so that we know whether you had antibodies before you got the vaccine. And then we'll look whether you got antibodies between your first 2 doses and then 1, 3, 6, and 12 months after your second dose. So the two things that we really don't know about transplant patients and the vaccines are, will they work as well in transplant patients as they do in non-transplant patients, because we have a modulated immune system? And will they be as durable? By durability, we mean, will they last as long in transplant patients as they do in non-transplant patients? And since this has been tested in, tens of thousands of non-transplant patients, we're going to compare what we discover among transplant patients with non-transplant patients. And this will have implications for, do transplant patients need more of a booster, need a different dose, need, if the general population recommendations will be 2 years after your second dose, you get a booster, maybe in transplant patients, it will have to be 1 year or something like that. So we're going to learn sort of what the recommendations should be for dosing frequency and boosters and things like that in transplant patients compared to non-transplant patients. The nice thing about this study is that, you go to the website is transplantvaccine.org. You go to the website, you read all about it. We have information there about advice on taking vaccines, information about vaccines that you, Amy, and your team were so kind as to help us put together in the information that we think transplant patients need to know about vaccines. And then you can also register for the study there, and you register for the study there, and we send you all the information, and we help arrange for all the blood work. We have an at-home device that can draw your blood without a needle. It's this really cool capillary blood thing. I call it the mechanical leech. You just stick it to your arm. It draws a little bit of blood off of you. You barely feel it. You send that tiny tube to us and we run it. For those that don't want to do that, we can just send you to LabCorp or something to get blood drawn that way. And then we will be able to, over time, start to get a sense of what is the biology of these vaccines in transplant patients.
Mm-hmm. Great. So who should join the trial?
Yeah, so we've actually had overwhelming interest in the trial, which is wonderful. I would say this: any transplant patient out there, anyone who has received an organ transplant out there who is in any way planning to get the vaccine should come to the website. And even if you're not planning to get the vaccine, you should come to the website and read the information about the vaccine, because it might alter the way you make decisions about the vaccine. So I would say everyone on this call and everyone who's a transplant recipient, come to transplantvaccine.org and read the information. If you are interested in being part of a study that will help the other 200,000 transplant recipients out there decide when to get vaccines, how we should do, all of the things we talked about. If you want to help with that effort, we would love to have you enrolled in the trial. We will probably, over time, sort of limit enrollment to different subgroups that we have, particular interest in, because we certainly don't need 200,000 people to participate in the trial, but all of that information will be there. And I would say the best thing is go to the website, read about it, and if you want to help, just click on the thing that says enroll, and we'll send you the information.
That's great. So then if I'm a patient and I enroll in this study and we find out something new for the transplant community, that, there is some new, adverse reaction or something about my kidney, could I get the information from the trial? What's going to happen?
Yeah, so we are providing patients what we find out about their antibody levels, so that there is a bonus in participating in the trial, in that you will know if you mounted an antibody response to the vaccine. Hopefully you did, but there may be instances where you didn't. So we'll be able to send you that information, and then we're going to report back to the transplant community on a semi-regular basis everything that we find. As soon as we enroll enough patients to where we think we can make a reliable conclusion about something, then we'll report that to the transplant community, obviously publish it, and make sure it's widely available to transplant providers and patients.
Okay, great. So just to anybody who's on this call and who's pre-registered, you're going to get information about the trial and where to go, educational information about COVID, and this video itself to share with anybody who maybe wasn't able to join right now. Okay, so I want you to know, you don't have to worry. Okay, perfect. So I want to shift to my patient panel now. I'm so grateful, as always, to have the voice of the patient be leading discussion. And these good people on this call have reached out to their communities to collect questions. And I'd like to spend the rest of the time asking the common questions that we're hearing from the transplant patient community to experts, and we can go from there. So I want to start with Jim, if that's okay. And you can kind of set us off, if you wouldn't mind, in your wonderful way.
Thank you, Amy. This has been excellent, and I think most of these questions already been addressed, but as we focus in on specific questions that respect, we reached out, for example, in TRIO to over 1,200 patients, both polling them as whether they're interested in taking the vaccine or not, whether they're concerned, and what questions they had. Most of them have been answered by what you all have said, but let me just focus on them and see if we can get some short summaries of what you've already said. First of all, they're worried about, could it affect the functioning of the transplanted organ? What a common and obvious question. And I know we don't have direct answers to that, based on what Dory just said as an example, but
how would
Bill?
we feel that this is a common question we heard when we polled everybody?
Right.
Could this lead to additional damage or cause our organ, our kidney or heart or whatever organ to stop functioning?
So I just echoing, I think some of what Dory had mentioned, but of course we don't have specific information. There has really not been a consistent sort of signal that prior vaccines that have been given to transplant patients put them at risk for things like rejection or loss of their organ. So for the most part, any vaccines that are given, even ones that produce a really good immune response, we don't usually see that. That said, there's always theoretical concern because the sort of double-edged sword of having a vaccine that generates a really good immune response is that, if you have something in your body that's not yours, that you were born with, if you will, it's possible it could be targeted theoretically kind of by an overzealous immune response. It's not something that we know anything about. It's something that people are going to be studying and following. I would say that in the main trials, we didn't see anything like kidney or liver damage in the sort of general people who were vaccinated. So that's reassuring, but that's sort of why the CDC says being immunocompromised and having a transplant is not a reason you can't get vaccinated, but of course the things we need to monitor. And that's why people are doing it.
And Dory, is the trial going to monitor kidney function?
Yeah, we're monitoring rejection episodes. We're monitoring, changes in medical status. We're monitoring COVID infection. We're monitoring side effects from the vaccine, et cetera, by, talking to the participants of this study when we at the times that we're getting the antibody work.
And if we learned in the course of this that, oh my gosh, there's an effect for organ failure, what would you do next?
Oh, trust me, if we had any inkling that that the vaccines would even start an immune response and start to show any evidence of injury to the allograft, we would get that information out as soon as we possibly can, because our goal is here to make sure that transplant patients stay safe.
Yes. Great. So, Jim?
Another common question we get is, are there any known adverse reactions with anti-inflammatory drugs? Not immune suppressant, but anti-inflammatory drugs.
So I can just say that there's no signal, like I said, that things like Tylenol, ibuprofen would interfere with antibody development after vaccines. And in fact, in the Pfizer trial, something like 20 or 30% of people took some kind of fever reducer or something like that, or pain reducer, and that wasn't shown to be an issue. So every person has their own reasons why they may or may not take Tylenol or ibuprofen. That's up to you and your transplant doctor, but from the vaccine perspective, not an issue.
Yeah, Bill, as you mentioned, I looked this up this morning, 25% of people after their first dose and 45% of people after their second dose took either ibuprofen or Tylenol or something like that in the Pfizer trial. And I looked it up this morning because, having received my second dose yesterday, I took Advil this morning because of a headache that the vaccine gave me as well. And as you said, Bill, you would think that if half of the participants had taken something during the course of the trial, we would have been able to find out if that impacted the development of immunity.
Well, the other question that comes up quite often, especially since we all share taking immune suppression drugs, even though they're different ones, and that affects our immune systems. So how do immune suppressant medications interfere with our body's ability to mount a good immunological response to protect us from COVID?
Yeah, so that's the thing we most are interested in understanding, is can transplant patients mount the same immune response because of the vaccine as non-transplant patients? Again, biologically, we would guess that the transplant patients can probably mount at least almost as good of a response, but there may be some slight decrease in the ability of transplant patients to respond to the vaccine, and that's one of the things that we're planning to study.
Well, the other part of that, I guess, is at various stages in that journey, you're taking more immune suppressant drugs, and then over time it goes down. So I'm sure it changes over time. What you just said, Dory, I appreciate that we have to get that information. We don't have it yet.
Yeah, and I think that's why Gabe earlier said that they're recommending that transplant patients wait at least a month or wait a month after the transplant. I've read numbers, in the recommendations anywhere between 1 to 6 months, and some of that would depend on whether you got induction with, for example, T cell depletion or B cell depletion, where we think that your immune system is so reduced that you wouldn't be able to mount a response to the vaccine. That's why ideally people should get vaccinated before, but we're distributing the vaccine in an unprecedented way, and who knows when people will have access to it.
Okay, thank you. And I'll pass it over to George. George, you're going to unmute yourself.
Hello, everyone. Can I be heard?
Yes, we can.
Oh, all right. Some of my club members sent in a couple of questions, so I don't know if I can go over those or. Okay. A personal question I had was, in addition to being a deceased donor kidney transplant recipient, I've had my kidney for 45 years. I'm also a minority. Thank you. Should I have any specific concerns, since I hear that COVID is affecting minorities at a higher rate than others? Should I have any specific concerns about my intent is to take the vaccine when I'm offered it, but I've not heard from my nephrologist yet in DC, so I want to hear from him first. But this is helping me to understand some things, and I'm sure helping some other club members. Another question, well, you want to field that one, or?
Yeah, so I think there are two issues here, right? One is, sure, when you get a vaccine offered to you, what is the decision you're going to make? But until then, as Gabe said, we don't really see the majority of the United States being vaccinated anytime in the next couple of months, right? Like the rollout is expected to go through the spring, if not the summer. Until then, we are at unprecedentedly high rates of community infection and spread. Transplant patients need to be careful, especially transplant patients who are from populations that have been that have had worse outcomes from COVID. And we're talking about both, socioeconomic characterizations as well as medical characterizations. And so I think all transplant patients need to be careful. And I will say, because this is important to say, that even if you get vaccinated, you should still act the same way you did prior to your vaccination, because of all of the things that we don't specifically know about it. And by that, I mean, you should avoid crowds, you should avoid risky situations, you should wear a mask, etc. I just got my second dose of the vaccine, and you can rest assured I'm not a transplant recipient. I'm actually not a high-risk group. There is no way I'm going to the grocery store without my mask on. And not just because it's required, but because, again, the vaccine is great, and we expect that it will do great things for us in reducing our risk, but it is not a 100% guarantee. And there's enough unknowns about it that I think we are not right now anywhere close to behaving differently having received the vaccine. The only difference is that our risk of getting this horrible infection and having very bad repercussions from it will be dropped.
So would the vaccine affect long-term recipients the club I have, the Quarter Century Club, everybody in there is, you come in at 25 years, but most of the members are 30, 40, 50 years out with their transplant. So are there any specific risks that you know of regarding someone that just got their transplant versus long-term?
No, of course we don't unfortunately know, much yet about transplant patients, but fortunately, the longer you've had your transplant, the older you are, right? I mean, that's good. And we do know that older patients have worse outcomes, like from COVID. And so I think that's why they would be prioritized as kind of the metric we talked about. I think what's, more kind of interesting is that if you're someone who's been on immunosuppression for a very long time and you're older, that may place you in a group that won't respond quite as well to the vaccine. This is totally hypothetical. We don't know. But if you were drawing the balance beam of things that make it more or less likely to get a nice bunch of antibody, being older and having been on Prograft for 30 years, or it's only been around for 10 years, but you know what I mean, would probably put you, that's like a consideration. It's not a risk per se, but a consideration.
A question, let me interrupt if I could. A question came through the chat that I think is critically important that I want to clarify here. So the question is, if the patient decides to get the vaccine, how does this affect family members who have not yet received the vaccine or vice versa, considering there is a small strain of the virus in the vaccine? I want to clarify, because this is, it's tough to keep all of these different types of vaccines clear. The mRNA vaccines that we are talking about do not have vaccine. They don't have virus in them in any capacity. They have a signal for a tiny part of a protein that in and of itself can't do anything. So the vaccine cannot give you the virus. The vaccine cannot shed virus like previous, we've always warned transplant patients about live attenuated viruses. That's very different. Those actually have viruses and are attenuated so that they don't cause damage, but classically have been riskier in transplant patients. Here, there is not virus in this vaccine, and so by taking the vaccine, you are not risking exposing your family members or yourself or anybody else to that virus.
I think I saw that going across. Would you get the COVID-19 vaccine annually, is like a flu shot, or is this going to be a one-time thing?
So that's one of the things we don't know. That's one of the things we actually really hope to answer better in our transplant study, right? Because the Moderna and Pfizer, they're going to be studying this in the general population. So they're going to make recommendations with the CDC, et cetera, for what should the general population do with this vaccine. And we, could translate that to transplant patients, but I think we are going to know whether the durability of this, how long the immunity lasts in transplant patients, is different from non-transplant patients. I think, Bill, you can probably comment to this better than I can. I think there are estimates in the, out there of anywhere between 6 months and 3 years. I think the more recent, estimates that I'm reading are in the 1 to 2 year range for how long they think the vaccine will last, and maybe longer. But again, that's in non-transplant patients. And so even if we knew what it was in non-transplant patients, it would be a tough thing to translate to transplant patients. But the good news is, in a year, we'll know what the immune systems look like of the people that got the vaccine already who were transplant patients.
Okay. One question that I was sent, that was sent to me this morning is, are there any specific drug-related issues that could make a recipient go into rejection that you guys know of? And I know this is a new study, but.
You mean with regards to the vaccine itself?
Correct. Is that going to affect, like, personally, I was on Imuran for 44 years and 11 months, and then back in October, I was taken off of Imuran because I needed to go on gout medicine. So I'm now on CellCept. So they're wondering whether or not the COVID vaccination is going to cause any issues with the transplant meds. They're going to have to switch meds or something.
Right. That's a good question. One of the thing we worry the most about is whether the transplant meds will make the COVID vaccine less effective. And there's been a lot of discussion of that. As Bill said earlier, and Bill, I'll let you clarify as well. You mentioned, Bill, that there hasn't been any evidence, at least so far, any signal that we think that the vaccine will make immunosuppression drugs less effective and thereby cause a rejection process or something like that. I mean, I think if we find out that certain immunosuppression agents just make it impossible for you to develop COVID immunity, we may have to switch people to other immunosuppression agents so that they can develop COVID immunity. But I don't see that as being a major issue. The major ones that might impact that are things like, you know, the monoclonal T-cell antibodies, B-cell antibodies, the ones that you get at the time of a transplant or at the time of a rejection that really suppress your immune system. But, you know, once you get 6 months out from the transplant, the maintenance agents, I would not predict would have a major impact on how well the vaccine works, but we just don't know.
Don't know yet.
Great.
Okay.
Okay, just for sake of time, let's shift to Candace.
Hi, thank you. So I'm a living donor transplant patient for almost 12 years, and I'm actually also 30 weeks pregnant. So my question is, personally as well, should I wait to get vaccinated until my baby is born? And then a follow-up to that, is it okay to get vaccinated if I'm still breastfeeding as well?
I think this is a Bill question.
Sure. I mean, they're amazing questions. First of all, congratulations. Secondly, so the CDC and the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology both say that being pregnant is not a reason that you cannot be vaccinated, and breastfeeding is not a reason that you cannot be vaccinated. That said, they recommend that there are case-by-case kind of discussions based upon the individual person's risk for getting sick, and they're what will make mom also feel comfortable. Like mental health and physical health are both important while pregnant. Not that I'm a pregnant person, but I've been affiliated with somebody who's pregnant. So, you know, you can start to construct something like if I were 37, I had type 1 diabetes, a lung transplant 6 months ago, and I worked in a daycare and I was 28 weeks pregnant, I would probably imagine, because we know that pregnant patients do worse with COVID, as probably do transplant patients. That seems like a better decision for me and baby. If I'm 23, a 23-year-old thin female who lives in Montana and I telecommute and I don't see anybody in my family, that's the other side of the spectrum where it's a discussion with your obstetrician. Hey, there is some unknown here. Let's proceed with caution. So I'm definitely not going to tell you a yes or no, and I defer completely to your doctor. But for what it's worth, the only things that we do know is that it does seem like if you're pregnant, you can get more sick than non-pregnant women. And we know that at least in the Moderna trial, they did submit some information in mice that showed that it was safe for the mice babies. You know, so one fringe benefit I'll mention is that we know, you know, definitely with flu vaccines and Tdap and things like that, that vaccinated moms do pass immunity to babies. And we know we're not vaccinating any 1-month-olds for a very long time.
Right.
But mom basically passively immunizes baby, particularly vaccinated in the 3rd trimester. It's not going to probably be quite as robust transfer as something like flu, but that's maybe a fringe benefit to consider.
Great. And as we've said earlier, our transplant community is quite small. So I do know quite a few pediatric transplant patients, and their parents have had a lot of concerns about them. So wondering, has the vaccine been tested on pediatric patients? And would a pediatric transplant patient also have priority for the vaccine?
Also great questions. What I'll say is the data that are published, that are like the best information, are kids down to 16 for the Pfizer vaccine. That's why we have that FDA kind of authorization for it. That said, Pfizer has been vaccinating children as young as 12 since October, and there is some information in that should come out in the next several months. But really the reason why it's not yet approved is because we don't have a lot of good information, which is often the case with children. I would imagine and hope that the same kind of risk type assessment among the kids would be the same as we do with adults. Like if you're a child who's, you know, on dialysis or you have diabetes or kidney transplant, you would be prioritized over those without. That would be my guess, but you know, we'll have to cross that bridge.
But just to make sure this is in the panel, so at the moment, people 16 or older, we have emergency authorization use, but for no one, including pediatric transplant patients that are younger than 16, correct?
Correct. And only for Pfizer. Moderna is for 18 and up. Correct me if I'm wrong on that, Bill.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great.
Wow. And so one last question for you. If children are not approved for the vaccines, should their caregivers still receive the vaccine? And would those caregivers be prioritized if they have a child who has a transplant and who is high risk?
So as Bill said, the prioritization has been state by state. So it's kind of up to the state to decide. I would certainly say, so remember, anyone unvaccinated right now, their main risk is acquiring the virus. Mm-hmm. And so if your bubble is, you know, if your entire family is vaccinated except you, and you don't leave the house, you're pretty safe. Right. If you're, you know, so I would say anyone around somebody who cannot be vaccinated right now, if those caregivers can be vaccinated or those family members can be vaccinated, that would be a wise move.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
So Louise, are there any questions from the chat or things to make priority here?
There are a few things that are coming through and that are new. So Candace and I both have living donors, and so living donors are wondering if they're at a higher risk, like if they get prioritized, and if there's any information yet on reactions to the vaccine or risks of getting the vaccine.
So I would place a living donor, at least from what we know biologically, as in the same risk group as somebody who, from the vaccine standpoint, as somebody who was not a living donor, as somebody who had, you know, has two perfectly functioning kidneys in terms of having complications from the vaccine. Now, that said, we do know that having a lower GFR in a lot of studies was associated with having worse outcomes from COVID. So if I were a living donor, I would be trying to get vaccinated as quickly as I can. Again, it's going to be state by state, but also if I were a living donor, I would be trying to quantify my GFR, you know, talk to my doctor and the healthcare system about, you know, CKD priorities and things like that. Even though, you know, it's kind of backwards. We tell donors if your GFR is 65, it's because you have one kidney, not two kidneys. But for this purpose, I would say, hey, look, my GFR is 65. I should be in a higher priority group for getting the vaccine, because we know that, at least from other studies, not necessarily in specifically to living donors, we know that lower GFR was associated with worse outcomes.
So we've talked about side effects in this panel before, and one of the things I personally and a lot of recipients are scared about is vomiting, right? Because we have to take our immunosuppressants, and I currently live in LA where it's a crisis right now in terms of hospital availability. So are there any signs that that's a side effect that we're seeing because it's a risk to us?
Have you seen that as a side effect for the vaccine after people take it?
Yeah, Bill, do you happen to know what I know nausea has been reported, but Bill, I think you know the percentages of the various side effects.
Yeah, fortunately, nausea, vomiting is not one of the most common side effects. Listen, everyone is different, unfortunately, or fortunately, they're different. But I think vomiting was actually, I'm just looking at the Pfizer data, was like less than 2% of people, and nausea, vomiting after the second dose in younger people was mild and maybe up to 20%. Not something that would necessarily prevent you from eating and drinking, but maybe you have some, like, you know, upset, if you will. So not like a predominant thing that people experience, to our knowledge.
Yep.
And
Great.
remember that in terms of side effects from administration of the vaccine, in most reports, it kind of happens over a 12-hour period, either soon after you get it for 12 hours or 12 hours after you get it for 12 hours or something like that. But the overwhelming majority of people no longer have any symptoms of, you know, any side effects from the vaccine within 24 to 48 hours. So it is a very, very short-lived side effect experience.
Great. All right. Unfortunately, we're at the end of our hour. I want to say a few things. We're going to send this information via email to people.